The first thing I noticed when I unlocked the front door of my own house was that the smell was wrong. 9 months in a plywood barracks outside Zesov, and I still knew the smell of my own home better than I knew my own face in the mirror. And this smell, lemon cleaner, somebody else's perfume, fresh paint, was not it. The second thing I noticed was that the framed photo of my swearing in, the one that used to sit on the hallway table, was gone. The third thing I noticed about 40 seconds later, standing barefoot in my own kitchen in my dusty uniform with my duffel still on my shoulder, was that my joint checking account had a balance of $17.41. $17.41. 9 months of combat pay, hazard pay, separation pay, and the savings I had built for 6 years before that. My wife, Loretta, knew the password. My father, Vernon, was the secondary signer because when I was 23 and naive and home from my first deployment, he had told me a good daughter trusts her father with her money, and I had believed him. I sat down on the kitchen floor because my knees stopped working. I did not cry. I am a logistics officer. The first thing a logistics officer does when a shipment goes missing is open a clean notebook and start writing down what she knows. So I sat on the tile in my own kitchen and I pulled my green notebook out of my cargo pocket and I started writing down what I knew. And what I did next, they didn't expect it. My name is Wren Holloway, and at the time this story starts, I had been a captain in the United States Army for 4 years, a wife for 6, and Vernon Holloway's only daughter for 32. I grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, in a yellow house 2 blocks back from the river, the kind of town where the same 6 families have been running everything since before the Civil War, and everybody knows whose granddaddy did what to whose grandmother. My father owned a Chevrolet dealership on Boundary Street for 31 years. He sold cars to deacons and shrimpers and the mayor and the mayor's mistress, and he believed, with the kind of belief most people reserve for God, that he was a self-made man. I was the kid who fixed things. When my brother Glenn broke the storm window throwing a baseball, I was the one who measured the pain and rode my bike to the hardware store. When my mother forgot to pay the water bill 3 months running, I was the one, at 14, who called the city office and worked out a payment plan in a voice I had practiced in the bathroom mirror. I joined ROTC at Clemson because the Army promised me a job where, if you did the paperwork right, things actually moved. Pallets, convoys, fuel, people. I loved it the way some women love horses. There is a particular kind of peace in a manifest that balances. Loretta and I met at a wedding in Bluffton when I was 25 and she was 23. She was a dental hygienist with a laugh that cracked in the middle, like she was always 1 second away from telling you a secret. She wore a sage green dress that night, and when I asked her to dance, she said only if I promised not to step on her toes, because she had to be at work Monday, and her boss noticed everything. I promised. I stepped on her toes twice. She married me anyway, 11 months later. In a backyard in Port Royal with 70 folding chairs and a tablecloth her grandmother had embroidered with little blue cornflowers along the edge. The night before I left for Poland, Loretta cut a 1-inch square out of the corner of that tablecloth, the corner with 1 whole cornflower on it, and she sewed it inside the left breast pocket of my uniform by hand, with thread she had bought that afternoon. She said, "So it's over your heart." She said, "So you come home." I remember the way her hair fell forward while she worked, and the way she bit the inside of her cheek when she concentrated, and the way I thought, this is the woman I will be buried next to. I remember it because I need you to understand that what came later did not come from a marriage that was never real. It came from a marriage that was real and then was not, and the difference between those 2 things is the entire reason I am telling you this. Here is what I missed. 3 things, specifically, that I rationalized for 9 months while I was eating powdered eggs at 4 in the morning and watching the sun come up over a country that was not mine. In month 2, Loretta told me on a video call that the dishwasher had broken and Vernon had paid $1,800 out of our joint account for a new one. And I said, okay, that's what the account is for. In month 4, she told me my father's truck had needed a transmission, $2,600, and she had moved the money because he was family and he would pay it back. I said, okay. In month 7, she told me she had taken a weekend in Charleston with her sister, $1,200 at a hotel on East Bay Street, and she had earned it after everything. I said, okay. 3 okays. 3 QAOKs adding up to almost $6,000, and I told myself the same story each time, which was that I was deployed and she was lonely and my father was old and family is family. And a logistics officer, of all people, should understand that some shipments take a longer route than expected. There were warning signs, too. I saw them. I just decided they were something else. Loretta stopped wearing her ring on video calls around month 5. She said her finger was swollen from the salt in the takeout. My father, who had never once in his life sent me a text message that was not an instruction, sent me 3 in 2 weeks, all variations of "Are you safe over there, sweetheart?" And I told myself he had finally softened with age. And my brother Glenn, who had never approved of my career and never approved of Loretta either, went suddenly quiet on the family group chat for 2 whole months. And I told myself he was busy with his roofing business. None of those were what I told myself they were. Every one of them was a flag, and I, the logistics officer, the woman who could spot a missing crate on a pallet from across a hangar, looked at all 3 and filed them under fine. I came home on a Tuesday in late October. The flight from Ramstein landed at Charleston at 2 in the afternoon. Loretta was supposed to pick me up. She was not there. I waited 40 minutes at the curb with my duffel between my boots, watching other soldiers get tackled by their kids in the parking lot before I called her. Voicemail. I called my father. Voicemail. I called my brother. He picked up on the 4th ring and said, "Oh, Ren," like that. "Oh, Ren." Like I was a piece of news he had been hoping somebody else would have to deliver. He said, "I'll come get you. Don't go to the house yet." I said, "Glenn, what are you talking about?" He said, "Just don't go to the house. Let me come get you." I said I was already in a cab. He said, "Please." He almost never said please. I went to the house anyway because that is what I do. I do not wait for somebody else to tell me what is happening on my own pallet. The cab dropped me at the end of our gravel drive, and I tipped the driver $20 I could not, it would turn out, actually afford. And I walked up to the porch of the little blue ranch house Lorettea, and I had bought 4 years earlier with my reenlistment bonus. The mailbox said Holloway in the same hand-painted letters I had done myself one Saturday in April. The hydrangeas Loretta had planted our first summer were dead, brown, untouched. The porch light was off in the middle of the afternoon, which is a thing you only notice if you are the person who used to leave it on. The key worked. That was the cruelest part, looking back. The key still worked. If she had changed the locks, I would have known in 3 seconds and I could have turned around and called somebody. But the key worked, and so I walked into a house that was technically still mine and found out, one room at a time, that nothing else in it was. The living room couch was gone. The dining room table was gone. The rug my grandmother had given us as a wedding present was gone. There was a different couch where ours used to be beige, cheap, the kind of couch you order online when you do not actually care what your house looks like, which is to say, the kind of couch you put in a house you are about to sell. The walls were a color called grige that real estate agents use because it does not commit to anything. The photo of my swearing in was gone from the hallway. The photo of our wedding was gone from above the fireplace. My uniforms were not in the closet. My books were not on the shelf. The thrift store coffee mug Loretta had given me on our 2nd anniversary, the one that said "World's Okayest Daughter" in chipped blue letters. The one we had laughed about for years, that was not on the kitchen counter where I had left it. I stood in my own kitchen and I opened my banking app on my phone, because by then I knew the way you know a leg is broken before you look at it. And the app loaded, and the joint checking account said $17.41. The joint savings said 0. The home equity line of credit, which we had opened together 2 years ago and never touched, said negative $38,400. 3 numbers. I read them 3 times. The dishwasher hummed in the corner, the new one Vernon had supposedly bought, and I thought, I could throw this phone through that window right now. I could. I really could. I didn't. That is the I could have but I didn't moment, and I want you to understand it, because it is the only reason any of the rest of this story happened the way it did. There was a version of me that afternoon who threw the phone, who tore the beige couch apart looking for receipts, who drove to my father's house and broke a window. That version of me would have spent the night in the Beaufort County Jail and the next 6 years in family court losing. The version of me who sat down on the kitchen tile instead, who pulled out a green notebook and a pen, who wrote at the top of a clean page the words inventory. October 22. 1447 hearts. That version of me is the one who is talking to you now. Restraint is not the same as weakness. Sometimes restraint is just a logistics officer recognizing that the shipment is not lost. The shipment is stolen. Those require different forms. I sat on that tile for an hour and a half. I wrote down every account number I could remember. I wrote down every credit card. I wrote down the date of the last deposit I had verified, which was September 14th, the day before my unit had moved forward, and I had stopped checking my phone. I wrote down a list of names: Loretta, Glenn, my mother, Darlene, who had passed 3 years before, and so could not have known any of this, which was somehow the only mercy in the whole situation. I wrote down the names of 3 people I was going to need. The first was Lieutenant Colonel Ruth Marin, my commanding officer for the last 4 years, who had been my mentor since I was a brand new butter bar lieutenant, terrified of writing my first convoy order. The second was a forensic accountant I had met once at a conference in Atlanta, whose card was, by the grace of God, still in my wallet. The third was my brother Glenn, who had said "Oh, Ren" on the phone, and who, I was beginning to understand, knew more than he had been able to say. I called Ruth Marin first. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to call you on leave, but I'm in a situation." She said, "Where are you?" I said, "In my kitchen." She said, "Is anybody hurt?" I said, "No, ma'am." She said, "Holloway, I'm going to ask you a question and I need a straight answer. Is this a domestic violence situation?" I said, "No, ma'am. It is a financial situation." There was a pause on her end, the kind of pause a senior officer takes when she is recalibrating from one kind of emergency to another. And then she said, "All right. Tell me everything slowly, in order." And so, on the tile floor of my emptied kitchen, with my duffel still on the floor in the hallway and my left breast pocket holding a 1-inch square of cornflower embroidered tablecloth that had crossed the Atlantic twice, I told my commanding officer that my wife and my father had spent 9 months of my deployment systematically draining everything I owned, and that I had let them. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "You are not going to do anything tonight. You are going to a hotel. You are going to eat something. You are going to sleep, even if it is bad sleep. Tomorrow morning at 0800, you are coming to my office. Do not contact your wife. Do not contact your father. Do not contact your brother. Bring the notebook." I said, "Yes, ma'am, because that is what you say." She said, "Ren." She used my first name, which she had done maybe 4 times in 4 years. She said, "Ren, every pallet has a paper trail. You taught me that. We are going to find this one." I checked into a Hampton Inn off Robert Smalls Parkway because it was the closest hotel I could think of that I had not been to with Loretta. The clerk was a kid of maybe 19 with a name tag that said Earl, and when I tried to pay with my debit card, it declined. And Earl, God bless him, looked at my uniform and looked at my face and said, "Ma'am, let's try the other one." It was the government travel card, the one I had used to fly home, and it worked. Earl did not say anything about the first card. He just handed me the key and said, "Room 214, ma'am. And there's a vending machine on the second floor if you didn't eat." I have thought about Earl, the night clerk at the Hampton Inn, more times in the last year than I have thought about most members of my own family. There is no telling ever who is going to be the person who keeps you upright in a hallway. Sometimes it is your commanding officer. Sometimes it is a 19-year-old with a name tag. I did not sleep. I sat on the bed in my uniform, and I called Glenn at 11:30 at night, against Ruth's instructions because I needed to hear it from him before morning. He picked up on the first ring this time. He said, "You went to the house." I said, "I went to the house." He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "Ren, I tried. I tried to tell you." I said, "When?" He said, "The group chat, when I went quiet." I went quiet because Dad told me if I said one word to you about any of it, he would tell your unit you were unstable, that you had threatened him, that you had a drinking problem. He said he had a friend at the VA who could make it stick. I didn't know if he could or he couldn't. I didn't know if you'd lose your commission. I'm a roofer, Ren. I'm a roofer who barely finished community college. He was talking about your career like he was talking about a thing he could break. I should have called you anyway. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I sat on a hotel bedspread in Beaufort, South Carolina at 11:38 at night, and I listened to my 41-year-old brother cry on the phone for the first time since our mother's funeral. Glenn, who had told me at 14 that I shouldn't join ROTC because I wasn't tough enough. Glenn, who had refused to come to my commissioning because he had a roofing job he could not move. Glenn, who had spent 20 years being, in our father's language, the real Holloway child. The son, the one who stayed, the one who didn't put on airs. Glenn, sobbing into a phone because our father had threatened to use the army against me, and Glenn had not been brave enough, fast enough, sure enough, to call me anyway. I said, Glenn. He said, what? I said, I'm not mad at you. I said, I need you tomorrow. I need you to tell me. In order what you saw, he said, I'll be there. Wherever you say, I'll be there. That was the first unexpected kindness, and it was not from a stranger. I want to tell you about my father now, because if you are picturing a movie villain, you are picturing the wrong man. Vernon Holloway was 68 years old that fall, 6'1", still strong in the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that looks honest in a photograph because the camera reads weather as character. He coached my little league team. He really did. He coached it for 4 seasons, and he was not a yelling coach. He was the kind of coach who would crouch down at the end of an inning and tell a crying 8-year-old that she had done her job and the throw had just gone wide, and that was baseball. I remember him doing that for me, specifically in 1998. I remember the smell of his aftershave, Old Spice, and tobacco when he hugged me after. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that the man who emptied my accounts was not a stranger to me. He was the man who had taught me to throw a curveball. The same man. Both of those things are true at once, and there is no resolving them. And anybody who tries to tell you grief is clean has never had to feel both of those things at once in the same chest. Vernon's dealership had been quietly dying for 2 years. I would learn this on day 3 of the unraveling, but I will tell you now so you understand. By the time I deployed in January, my father owed the IRS $143,000 in back taxes and payroll. He had taken out a second mortgage on the house in 2022. He had quietly sold the boat. He had been selling cars below cost to move them off the lot just to make the floor plan payments to the bank that financed his inventory. The man who had told me at 23 that a good daughter trusts her father with her money was, at 68, drowning in the kind of slow financial death that men of his generation would rather burn the house down than admit out loud. And his daughter the captain, the logistics officer, the one with the steady direct deposit and the deployment bonuses. His daughter had handed him the password to the account 6 years earlier and never thought to take it back. I do not say this to forgive him. I say it because the math of betrayal is almost never as simple as the word makes it sound. The math of betrayal almost always has, somewhere in it, a smaller, sadder equation that the person being betrayed never got to see. I was at Ruth Marin's office at 0750 the next morning. She was already there. She had 2 cups of coffee on her desk and a yellow legal pad and like a thunderstorm rolling in off the Atlantic. She said, sit. She said, before we start, I want to tell you something. I went to law school before I went into the Army. I passed the South Carolina bar in 2003. I have not practiced in 21 years, and I am not your attorney. But I am your commanding officer, and what I am about to do for you is going to look like both at once, and I want that on the record between us. Do you understand? I said, yes, Miss Ma'am. She said, good. Open the notebook. We worked for 6 hours straight. Ruth made calls. I made calls. By noon, we had pulled every account statement back to January. By 2, we had a forensic accountant on a video call from Atlanta, the same one whose card was in my wallet. A woman named June with reading glasses on a beaded chain who said honey in a way that did not sound condescending. By 4, we had a timeline. Loretta and Vernon had started small in February, the month after I deployed. A $600 transfer here, a $900 transfer there, always with a memo line that said something like household or repairs. By April, they had stopped writing memos. By June, they had drained the joint savings to pay off Vernon's floor plan note at the bank. By August, they had opened the home equity line of credit using a notarized signature that June confirmed in the call was forged. Not subtly, not even competently. Loretta had signed my name, and the notary, who turned out to be a woman named Bia, who worked at a mailboxes, etc. in Port Royal and who was, it would later be established, Vernon's second cousin on his mother's side, had stamped it without verifying my identity, because I was, of course, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. That was the moment Ruth stopped being just my commanding officer. That was the moment a forged federal document came into the equation, and June, the forensic accountant, said, "Oh, honey," and Ruth said, "Always, this is not a divorce anymore. This is a federal crime." And I sat in her office with my hands folded around a cup of cold coffee, and I felt, for the first time since I had walked into my own kitchen, something other than grief. I felt the quiet, cold, almost peaceful of a manifest balancing. I felt the shipment locate itself. But before we get to the calm, I have to tell you about the spiral. Because in between the kitchen floor and the cold click, there were 9 days where I tried, 3 separate times, to fix this the soft way. I am telling you about those days because I owe you the truth, and the truth is that even with a commanding officer and a forensic accountant in my corner, even with a notebook full of evidence, even with the home equity fraud already documented, even then, 3 separate times in 9 days, I almost went back. Almost. That is the part of these stories nobody tells, and it is the part that, if you have ever been the one being betrayed, you will recognize before I finish the sentence. The first attempt was on day 3. Loretta finally answered my call. She had been at my father's house the whole time, which I knew because Glenn had told me. She picked up, and her voice was the same voice she had used the night before I deployed, the soft one, the one I had married. She said, "Ren, baby, please come over. Let me explain. Daddy and I, we made mistakes, we did. But we can fix this as a family. Please, I am asking you, please come over and let us explain. And I want you to know, with no pride and no varnish, that I almost went. I sat in the parking lot of the Hampton Inn for 35 minutes with my keys in my hand and the cornflower patch over my heart, and I almost drove to my father's house and let them explain. Because they were my family, and I was tired, and I was 32 years old and standing in a hotel parking lot in October, and the version of forgiveness Loretta was offering would have let me sleep that night in a bed instead of on a bedspread. I am not above that. Nobody is above that. Anybody who tells you they are above that has never been that tired. I did not go. I called Ruth instead, and Ruth said one sentence, which was, "Holloway, if you go in that house tonight, anything you say becomes part of the record they are building against you." And I understood, finally, that they had not invited me over to confess. They had invited me over to film me losing my temper. They had a phone ready. They had a story ready. They were already building the case that the unstable veteran had come home and threatened her elderly father, and the joint accounts had been emptied for safekeeping, for her own protection. They were going to make me the villain in my own house. The second attempt was on day 5. This one was Loretta texting me a photo of the cornflower tablecloth. The whole tablecloth spread on my father's dining room table, with the missing corner where she had cut the square for my pocket. She wrote underneath it, "I still have this." I still think about that night. I know I don't deserve to ask, but can we just talk? Just you and me. No daddy, no lawyers, just us. I'll meet you anywhere. And I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and I looked at the photograph of that tablecloth, for I do not know how long. 20 minutes. 40. The cornflower in the photo was the same blue as the one in my pocket. There is a particular kind of evil that knows exactly which thread to pull, and Loretta, whatever else she was, had always been an excellent observer of which threads mattered to me. I did not text back. I forwarded the photograph to Ruth. Ruth replied with 3 words, "Evidence of contact." That was it. 3 words, and the photograph slid from a memory into a file, and the file went into a folder, and the folder went into the case. And the case began slowly to have a shape. The third attempt was on day 7, and this one was harder because this one was my father, and this one was in person. He came to the Hampton Inn. I do not know how he knew where I was staying. I suspect Glenn, who, I will be honest, was doing his best but was not built for this kind of secrecy. Vernon walked into the lobby at 4 in the afternoon, wearing a button-down shirt and his good belt and his Sunday shoes, the way he used to dress for parent-teacher conferences. And he sat down in one of those mauve hotel lobby chairs, and he asked Earl, the night clerk who was working a double, to please call room 214 and ask Miss Holloway to come down. He called me Miss Holloway, not Captain, not sweetheart. Miss Holloway. He was already in his head putting me back in a smaller chair. I came down because I wanted to see his face. I want to be honest about that. I did not come down to forgive him. I came down because I wanted to see in person what a man looks like when he has spent 9 months stealing from his own daughter and is now sitting in a hotel lobby in a button-down shirt pretending he came to talk. I sat across from him. I did not hug him. He looked older than 9 months should have made him look. His hands were shaking, not a lot, but enough that I noticed when he picked up a paper cup of lobby coffee. He said, "Rennie," he had not called me Rennie since I was 11. He said, "Rennie, your mother would be ashamed of us, all of us. Me included." I let him sit with that for a second. Then I said, "Which part?" He said, "What?" I said, "Which part would she be ashamed of? The part where you stole from me, or the part where you used my wife to do it, or the part where you forged my signature on a home equity line of credit, or the part where you came here today to see if you could still talk me out of it? I want to be specific, Daddy. Which part?" He looked at me for a long time. He had blue eyes, the same blue as Glenn's, the same blue as the cornflower in my pocket, the same blue as my mother's. He said, "Rennie, I am going to lose the dealership." I said, "I know." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Every pallet has a paper trail." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I know, Daddy. I know about the IRS. I know about the second mortgage. I know about the boat. I know about the floor plan. I know what you used my money for, and I know what Loretta used my money for, and they are not the same thing, and that is part of why we are sitting here." He sat back in the chair. He did something with his mouth that on another man would have been a smile. On him, it was the face he made when a customer had caught him in a lie about a transmission. It was almost, and this is the thing I cannot scrub out of my memories, it was almost admiring. He said, "Who taught you to think like that?" I said, "You did, Daddy. You taught Glenn to swing a hammer, and you taught me to read a balance sheet. And I do not know if you ever understood that those are not the same gift." He sat there with his coffee cup, and for the first time in my entire life, my father did not have a next sentence. He just sat there, and then, very quietly, he said, "I am sorry, Rennie. I am." And God help me, I almost reached across the table and took his hand. I didn't. I stood up. I said, "Daddy, I love you. I want you to hear that because I am only going to say it once today, and I do not know when I will say it next. I love you, and I am also going to do what I have to do, and those two things are not going to cancel each other out, no matter how badly you and I both want them to." He nodded. He did not look up. I walked back to the elevator and I pushed the button and I did not look back because if I had looked back, I would have gone back. And the elevator came and I got in and the doors closed. And somewhere between the second floor and the lobby, I started crying for the first time since I had walked into the kitchen. And I cried, hard, all the way back to room 214. And when I got there, I sat on the floor with my back against the door for 30 minutes because that is what a valley moment looks like in real life. It does not look like a movie. It looks like a 32-year-old captain on a hotel hallway carpet crying into the sleeve of her uniform because she has just figured out that loving somebody and protecting yourself from are sometimes the same act. And there is no version of that math that does not cost. That was the night I made the decision, not in anger, not in rage. In the quiet, after the crying stopped, when I was sitting on the carpet with the back of my head against the door, and I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform, and I felt the little square of tablecloth there, and I thought, she sewed this in here so I would come home. And I am home. And what I do next is what I do as the woman who came home. That is who decides, not the woman who left, not the woman who married her, the woman who came back. I get to choose. I will tell you what I chose, because the choice itself was almost boring. Boring is the right word. I chose to file everything. I chose to file a police report for the forged signature. I chose to file a federal complaint through Ruth and through proper channels for the home equity fraud, because forging a federal loan document is not a thing the state of South Carolina handles alone. I chose to file for divorce with a Beaufort family law attorney named Nell that June, the forensic accountant, connected me to. A woman who had done 16 years of military divorces and who used the phrase, "Let's just get this on paper," the way other people use the phrase, "Let's pray about it." I chose to file a civil suit separately against my father for the funds taken from accounts on which he had been a secondary signer and on which he had, the bank records would show, transferred money to entities, his dealership LLC, his personal account, that were demonstrably not for my benefit. I chose to do all of this in a span of 9 business days, with the help of Ruth and June and Nell, and I did not call Loretta and I did not call Vernon. And I did not post a single thing on the internet because every pallet has a paper trail, and the paper trail does not need a caption. I want to tell you about the moment Loretta got served because it is the moment the wheels truly came off, and because it is the moment my father, for the first time, broke in a way I had not predicted. The papers were served on a Thursday at 4 in the afternoon. Loretta was at my father's house, on the back porch, because Vernon had a habit of having his afternoon coffee on the back porch, and Loretta had moved in with him at some point in week 2. I would learn this through Glenn, who by now was, in his quiet and imperfect way, my eyes inside that house. The process server was a young man named Hugo, who had been doing the job for 2 years and who had, Nell would tell me later, the gentlest disposition of any process server she had ever worked with. He rang the doorbell. Vernon answered. Hugo asked for Loretta Holloway, and when Loretta came to the door, he handed her the divorce papers and the civil complaint at the same time, and he said, "Ma'am, you have been served, and have a good evening." He turned and walked back to his car. According to Glenn, who was, by coincidence, fixing a gutter on the neighbor's house at the time, and who had been positioned there, not by coincidence, for exactly this hour. According to Glenn, Loretta stood on the front porch, holding the papers and reading the first page, and her face went through 3 colors. White, then red, then a kind of gray that Glenn had only ever seen on people at funerals. And then she did the thing I had not predicted. She turned around and she handed the papers to my father. She said, "Daddy, fix this." Just like that. "Daddy, fix this." Glenn heard it from 1 yard over. He told me about it that night on the phone, and he said, "Ren, I have known Loretta for 6 years, and I have never, in my entire life, heard her sound like that. She sounded like a child. She sounded like she was 11 years old. And Dad, he just stood there. He just stood there holding the papers, and he said, 'Loretta, honey, I don't know that I can.'" That was the moment my father, in his own front yard, in Sunday shoes he had not changed out of since coming back from the hotel lobby 2 days before, understood, finally, that he had used up the last thing he had to use, which was the willingness of women who loved him to call him daddy in a tone that asked him to make the world stop. He had used it on my mother for 30 years. He had used it on me for 32. He had used it on Loretta for 6. And on a Thursday afternoon in October, at the age of 68, with the papers shaking in his hand, he ran out of women who were going to call him daddy like that ever again. Glenn said it was the first time in his life he ever felt sorry for our father, and the last. The civil case took 11 months. I am not going to pretend it was clean or fast or that the law moved with any particular grace. It did not. It moved like a slow, heavy pallet across a warehouse floor, with 2 people pushing and 1 person yelling and several pieces of paperwork getting lost along the way. But it moved. June's forensic report was clean. The forged notary was prosecuted separately by the state. Bia, the second cousin at the mailboxes, etc., lost her notary commission and was charged with a misdemeanor. And the last I heard, she was working at a different mailboxes, etc., in a different town, which is its own kind of South Carolina ending. The home equity line of credit was unwound by the bank because the federal complaint went through, and the underwriting officer who had approved it, a man named Calvin, who had, the investigation revealed, also been quietly approving Vernon's floor plan extensions for 2 years without proper documentation, was quietly let go. The bank settled with me out of court for the full $38,400 and an additional sum I am not allowed by the settlement to discuss, which is fine, because the sum was never the point. The divorce was simpler than the criminal case. Loretta, on Nell's advice and on her own attorney's advice, did not fight the financial settlement. She had no leverage. She had only her own signature on a forged document and her own withdrawals from a joint account she had no income justification for, and her attorney, a tired man named Dale, who Nell had worked across the table from many times, told her in plain language that fighting it would extend her exposure to the criminal case and that the best thing she could do was sign and accept and try to start a quiet life somewhere else. She did. She signed. We were divorced on paper 8 months and 3 weeks after the day I sat on my own kitchen floor. The hearing took 14 minutes. I wore my dress uniform. She wore a sage green dress. I do not know if she chose it on purpose. I have decided not to ask. I want to tell you about the secondary account because this is the hidden power, and this is the part that I think only people who have served, or who love somebody who has, will fully understand. When you deploy, the Army gives you the option of a savings deposit program. It is a quiet thing. It is not advertised. It does not appear on your joint bank statements at home. It pays 10% interest on up to $10,000 of your deployed pay, and the money is held in a separate federal account under your name only. I had enrolled in it on day one of my deployment, the way I always do, the way Ruth had taught me to do on my very first deployment as a butter bar lieutenant, because she had said back then, Holloway, things happen at home. Things you do not want to think about while you are over there. Make sure you have a separate account that nobody at home can touch. Make sure you have a paper trail nobody else is on. Loretta did not know about it. Vernon did not know about it. There was no joint signer. There was no notary. There was no app on my phone they could see. There was, after 9 months, just shy of $11,000 in it, with interest, and that money was by federal regulation, mine alone. It was not a lot of money in the context of what they had taken. It was, however, exactly enough money to put a deposit on a rental, hire Nell, retain June for the forensic work the bank's investigators were not going to do for free, and feed me for the 6 months it took the rest of the case to move. Ruth, 4 years earlier, had handed me a small piece of advice in a hallway, and 4 years later, that advice had become the thing that kept me upright. That is what mentorship is. That is what it actually looks like in real life. It is not a speech. It is one sentence in a hallway about a federal savings program, and 4 years later, you do not lose your house because of it. There was a phone call near the end. I want to tell you about it because it is the climax of this story in the only sense that matters. It came 3 days before the criminal sentencing. Vernon called me from his cell phone at 7 in the evening. I let it ring twice. I picked up. He said, "Rennie?" I said, "Daddy." He said, "I just want to say one thing to you." I said, "All right." He said, "Rennie, your mother would understand why I did it." She would. She knew about the dealership. She knew before she passed. She told me, "Vernon, take care of it. Take care of it however you have to." And what I did because she told me to. That is the truth. You can believe me or you cannot, but that is the truth. I want you to understand what he was doing because he was a master at it, and I had grown up watching him do it to other people my whole life. He was reaching, in the last available second, for a guilt weapon. He was invoking my dead mother. He was saying, in code, your mother is on my side, and if you go through with this, you are also betraying her. He had used that weapon on Glenn for 40 years. He had used it on me, more times than I could count, in the 18 years I had lived under his roof. He was using it now because it was the last weapon he had, and because in his own warped, drowning way he still believed it would work, because it always had. And I, sitting in the little rental house I had moved into 3 weeks earlier with the world's okayest daughter mug, which Glenn had quietly retrieved from a box in Vernon's garage and given back to me, sitting on the counter, I let the silence go on for about 4 seconds. And then I said one sentence. I said, "Daddy, if Mama told you to take care of it, why did she not tell me?" That was it. One sentence. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not argue with the premise. I just asked him the one question that the premise could not survive. Because my mother and I had talked on the phone every Sunday at 4 o'clock for the last 6 years of her life, and she had never, not once, told me my father was in financial trouble. And Vernon knew that, because he had been in the room for some of those calls, complaining that I was tying up the line. He had no answer. He was quiet on the other end for a very long time. Then he said, "Rennie, I am tired." I said, "I know, Daddy." He said, "I will see you at the sentencing." I said, "I know, Daddy." He hung up. That was the climax. There was no shouting. There was no thrown object. There was a 68-year-old man on the other end of a phone line, finally understanding that the daughter he had raised to read a balance sheet had grown up to be a woman who could read him and would not be lied to about her own mother, and was going to do, the day after tomorrow, exactly what the paperwork said she was going to do. He was sentenced to 26 months in a federal facility for the home equity fraud, with credit for time served and an early release possibility at 14 months for good behavior. Loretta took a plea deal on the related charges and was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, 2,000 hours of community service, and full financial restitution on a schedule that, given her dental hygienist salary, will follow her into her 50s. Bea kept her job at a different mailboxes, etc. Calvin, the underwriter, quietly relocated to Georgia. The dealership closed in March. The yellow house on Boundary Street, the one I grew up in, was sold at auction in June, and the new owners are a young couple from Charleston, who Glenn tells me have already painted the shutters blue. The social consequence in a town like Beaufort was not the court case. The social consequence was the casserole. Let me explain. In Beaufort, when something terrible happens in a family, the church ladies bring casseroles. They have been doing this since before the Civil War. It is not optional. It is not even religious anymore, really. It is just what a town does to acknowledge that a wound exists. When my mother died, our front porch had 11 casseroles on it by sundown the day after. When Glenn's first marriage ended, 8 casseroles. When the Petersons 3 streets over lost their boy in Afghanistan, 14 casseroles, 2 pies, and a ham. The casserole count is, in our part of the world, the most accurate measurement of community opinion that exists. 3 days after the sentencing, my front porch at the rental house had 19 casseroles on it. 19, I counted. There was a tuna noodle from Mrs. June Whitfield, who had been my mother's best friend. There was a chicken and rice from Peggy at the diner where my mother used to take me on Saturdays. There was a pimento cheese sandwich tray of all things from old Mrs. Ida Calloway, who was 91 years old and who had, Glenn later told me, walked the tray over personally, 3 blocks, in the heat, because she said she wanted to lay eyes on the captain. There was a note tucked under the pimento cheese that said, in shaky handwriting, your mother would be proud. Vernon was always a peacock. You are the eagle, Mrs. Ida. I still have the note. It is in the same green notebook from the kitchen floor. Vernon's porch that same week had 0 casseroles. I am not exaggerating for effect. Glenn drove by twice. 0. The town had decided in the quiet, agreed-upon, unspoken way that towns decide these things, that the daughter was the one who deserved feeding, and the father was the one who could fix his own dinner from now on. That is what a real social consequence looks like in a real place, between real people. It does not look like a viral post. It looks like 19 casseroles, and one shaky handwritten note about a peacock and an eagle, and a porch on Boundary Street with nothing on it but a folded newspaper. There was an apology near the very end that I did not expect. It came from Glenn, in writing, 2 months after the sentencing, on a piece of lined paper torn out of one of his roofing estimate notebooks. He brought it over on a Sunday afternoon and handed it to me on the porch and said, "Don't read it now, read it later. I read it that night." It said, "Ren. I want to say this on paper because I am better on paper than out loud. I should have called you the first week of February when Dad came over and asked me to keep my mouth shut. I was scared he could hurt you with the army. I told myself I was protecting you. I was protecting me. I was protecting the version of me that didn't have to call my sister overseas and tell her that her family was robbing her. That was a coward's version of me, and I am sorry. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am telling you I see it, Glenn. It did not fix anything. It did not undo a single transfer or unforge a single signature or bring back the rug my grandmother had given us for our wedding. It mattered anyway. It mattered because Glenn, my brother, the roofer, the one who had been raised to believe that the real Holloway child was the son who stayed, had picked up a pen and written the words that was a coward's version of me in his own handwriting on a roofing estimate page and signed it. He could have called. He had called. But he had also written it down because he understood, somewhere in him, that I was the kind of person who needed it on paper. He had learned, after 32 years, how to apologize to me specifically. That is not nothing. That is, in some families, a kind of miracle. I want to tell you where I am now because I think you have earned it after all this. I am still a captain. I am up for major in 2 sickles. Ruth Marin retired from the active reserve last spring and is now in private practice in Charleston, where she handles, exclusively, financial fraud cases against deployed service members. Her first 3 clients were referred by me. I have not been able to bring myself to ask what her success rate is, because I am afraid it will make me cry in her office, and I have already done that twice, and there is a limit. Glenn and I have dinner every other Sunday at a place called the Shrimp Shack on Ladies Island, where the owner, Hugo, a different Hugo, not the process server, knows our order and brings sweet tea without asking. Glenn has a new girlfriend, a kindergarten teacher named Iris, who once asked me, very seriously, over dinner, whether I thought my father would ever be sorry. And I said, "Iris, I think he already is." And I think it does not change anything. And both of those things are true at the same time. And that is what being a grown person is. She nodded. She is going to be good for Glenn. My mother's grave is in the cemetery behind the Episcopal Church on Carteret Street. I go on the first Sunday of every month. I bring coffee from the diner because Peggy makes it the way Mama liked it, with too much sugar and a little cream. I sit on the bench. I tell her out loud what happened that month. I told her about the casseroles. I told her about Mrs. Ida's note. I told her about the peacock and the eagle. I told her about the moment Vernon ran out of women who would call him daddy in that tone. And I told her I was sorry she had ever been one of them. The wind moved in the live oaks above her stone, the way it always does on the coast, and I chose to believe that it was an answer. You are allowed to choose to believe things like that. It does not make you weak. It makes you a person who lost her mother and still has to live afterward, which is most of us, eventually. The cornflower patch is still in the breast pocket of my uniform. I did not take it out. I thought about it. I sat one night with a seam ripper in my hand, and I thought, this is the thing she sewed in here to bring me home, and she did not bring me home. And I do not owe this square of cloth a place over my heart. And then I thought, no, she did not bring me home. I came home. The cloth was just along for the ride. And what the cloth means now is not what she meant by it. What it means now is that I came home and stayed home, and I get to decide what symbols mean in my own life. And this one means that I survived. And a sage green dress in a backyard in Port Royal cannot retroactively unmake that. So I left it. It is over my heart. It always will be. It just answers to a different name now. The world's okayest daughter mug is on my kitchen counter in the little rental house. I drink coffee from it every morning. The handle has a chip now from where Glenn dropped it, bringing it back from Vernon's garage, and I think the chip improves it. Nothing whole stays whole in this life. The trick is to keep using the cup anyway. Here is the universal truth line, if you want one. People who underestimate you almost never realize they have done it until the day they need something from you, and you are still polite, still calm, still measured, and still completely unavailable to be used. That is the day they find out. It is not loud, it is not satisfying in the way the movies sell. It is quiet, it is a phone call with one question on it. It is a porch with 19 casseroles on it and another porch with none. It is a logistics officer with a green notebook on a kitchen floor, doing inventory. I want to leave you with this. I do not know what happened in your life. I do not know whose name is in the place where mine had Vernon and Loretta. But I know that if you are listening to this at 1 a.m. with your phone face down on your chest, then somebody somewhere in your life has decided that you are the safe one to take from. They have decided that because you are steady, or because you are far away, or because you have always picked up the check, or because you have always answered the phone, they have decided you are the pallet that will not be missed. And I want to tell you, from a kitchen floor in Beaufort, South Carolina, that every pallet has a paper trail. Every single one. Even yours. Especially yours. And the day you decide to open the notebook is the day everything starts to shift, slowly the way heavy things shift, toward where it should have been all along. So here's just the question I want to leave you with, and I am not going to tell you the answer, because the answer is not mine to give. Who in your life right now is counting on you not to look at the paperwork? Not who has hurt you, not who has betrayed you. Who is counting, today, this week, this month, on the fact that you will not open the notebook? That is the question. Sit with it. Do not answer it tonight. Just sit with it. And tomorrow, if you want, you can open the notebook. It is allowed. It was always allowed. Nobody told you, but it was always allowed. The porch light is on at my little rental house tonight. I leave it on now. I am the person